and he and other celebrities will make a video just for you. So I kind of underscored that. The fun of my career has really been about sort of dark money and the corrupting influence money in the system. To show just like Mr. Scaramucci didn't quite know what he was getting into, voters on a daily basis don't necessarily know who's trying to impact and influence our elections.
How do you do, and by the way, we talk a lot about campaign finance reform, dark money. We had Jane Mayer here with us a couple of months ago. Other than repealing a constitutional amendment to get rid of Citizens United or a court overruling its own decision, how do you ultimately ever deal with the most pernicious impact of dark money from a small segment of the population?
No, and that's I was Attorney General before Governor, took the first case all the way at the U.S. Supreme Court after Citizens United. We've seen what it's done, right? About 2% of all outside spending prior to that came from groups that didn't disclose where that money was coming from. 2018 midterms, it's about half of all the spending of outside groups. So I think you got to recognize at some point, look, we need a 28th Amendment or we need a different Supreme Court. But until then, at least we can add sunshine and transparency. Like if elected officials are effectively going to be like NASCAR, sponsored by all kinds of people, we ought to at least know who's doing the sponsoring. I did an executive order in Montana as an example that said, I can't tell you you can't spend in our elections, but corporations, if you want to contract for any state government services or sell any products, you have to disclose all the different ways that you're either contributing or spending to impact our elections. Think about, and I do that on day one as president, think about how the federal government did it. They contract with dang near every company in the country and indeed the world. So at least adding that sunshine and transparency for starters. And I passed a law in Montana with a 2/3 Republican legislature that said 90 days out from election, I don't care if you call yourself Americans for America, whatever it is, you have to disclose all the spending in the elections. That dried up that dark money spending.
Did you just say dang there? Did you say that, Governor? I just want to be clear. Can we talk about...
Well, we're on public radio. I didn't want to say damn.
You're calling, thank goodness for that. Your calling card, as I said at the beginning, Trump won your state 20 points on the same day you were reelected. Obviously, that's part of the message that you're getting out. But the more I read about Montana, the Republicans in the legislature you deal with are not the kind of Republicans who have basically caused the massive dysfunction in Washington. I read about something called the Solutions Caucus, which is sort of the opposite of the No Solutions Caucus in Washington. So you're more sort of a purplish kind of state, really, than a red state. Are you not, Governor?
Well, yeah, I think in as much as that we're kind of libertarian that cares about our neighbors. We don't think government's going to provide all of the solutions, don't always trust government, but we care about our neighbors. And there are business-based Republicans that I work with. I mean, now my legislature's 60% Republican. It used to be 2/3. That recognize that in order to have a vital and viable community, you have to have a good education system. You have to invest in base infrastructure. You have to make sure we have welcoming communities. So I do think that that's replicable beyond Montana, because if we actually get out of the politics, right, most people's lives are too busy to care about politics, but they want a safe community. They want a decent job. They want good schools, a roof over their head, clean air and clean water, and the belief you can do better for that next generation than yourself. Those are the values that I've kind of organized around, and I think those are the values that can transcend.
But you talk about the people who might want those things, but we see in Washington where those things are executed that there is just diehard bipartisanship now. There isn't the shift that you're talking about. A lot of people would argue there's a lack of civility, and you've talked about the civility that you can find in Montana, in Helena, at the State House to get things done. But how on earth could that happen in this climate?
Yeah, but even think like I got Medicaid expansion through in 2015 was the heart of sort of the anti-Obamacare time. But the way I did it is not just working in the State House. Actually, when 20% of rural hospitals in this country are at risk of closing, I mean, I went rural community to rural community to say, forget about Barack Obama or Obamacare, forget about your politics. Let's talk about what you need for this community. So I think the next president has to, sure, spend time in Washington, D.C., but if, like Mitch McConnell's still the leader, you should be spending much time making your case to America or spending time in Kentucky as you should in D.C. Because once folks are actually talking to the elected officials, trying to hold them accountable, I think you can find some wins in there. Now, I'd love to blow up the filibuster as an example. I think that's nothing more than something that'll cause the status quo, which means government's not going to work. But if anybody gives up and thinks we're going to spend the rest of this time in this representative democracy just governing by executive order, I think that's not a good way to think about what we need to be doing.
Can we stay on healthcare for a minute since you
I think we
mentioned Medicaid expansion? Obviously, the big debate has been around Medicare for all and how it's going to be paid for. You're a sort of a Biden-esque fix the Affordable Care Act kind of guy. Is that correct?
Yeah, or Biden's a Bullock-ish.
Oh, well, whatever it is, yeah. So explain to us how that would work. I mean, would there be a public option like President Obama attempted to do but failed? How would it, what do you do?
Like, let's begin with the base premise that there ought to be access to affordable care for everyone. And we're about 90% there with coverage. That doesn't always mean it's affordable. And you could actually get to the other 10% by doing things like expanding Medicaid in those states that haven't and auto-enrolling people into exchange with a little bit more subsidies. But what I'd do is turn around and say, all right, a public option buy-in, Medicare for anybody that wants to buy in. It is, and this goes back to the dark money side of it, it is insane to me that we pay more for prescription drugs than any other country in the world, and Costco can negotiate prescription drug price, the federal government can't. Enterprise medical billing and out-of-network charges, you could do that at the federal level. And then we have to start looking at sort of overall payment reform. But I don't think that the best way to get to that point of access and affordability, when you think the biggest step that we made in healthcare since Medicare was actually the Obamacare. Affordable Care Act. Republicans have spent 70 times trying to get rid of that. I don't think that the best policy is to tell about 156 million people, if you like your employer-sponsored care, you no longer can have it. I also think it's bad politics. For where we need to win, at the end of the day, this is about math. This is about winning Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania. And I don't think that's the best way to go into that general election saying we're going to take away everybody's health care.
Do you agree with Biden's assessment the last couple of days that the approach to Medicare for all on the part of our senator here, Elizabeth Warren, is elitist?
Look, I had said long before that we're already on our way to losing this election. If you think about it, if what we're talking about is what we're going to take away from people along the way, and like their health care. So you could call it elitist. I don't think it's the best way to get where we need for people, for sure.
We're talking to Steve Bullock, who's the governor of Montana and a candidate for the Democratic nomination for the presidency.
And to stay on that for a moment, what about the other math? You just talked about the math of winning the election, but where does math come into play for funding these plans? And how much of that is a concern of you for the Elizabeth Warren plan?
Well, for somebody that's actually had to balance budgets and as a governor, as an executive, make a budget work. Yeah, when you think about it right now, we spend about $4 trillion a year. That's federal government on everything. Notwithstanding the fact we only bring in $3 trillion. When she's talking about spending another $2.5 trillion every single year for her proposals and for health care, I mean, at some point, everybody's going to get hit. You know, the idea, well, Medicare for all, and we'll just make the millionaires and billionaires pay for it. I don't think that that's, at the end of the day, something that most people are comfortable with of what we're going to do in expanding government. Let's all begin, though, with that base premise that at least it seems Democrats recognize that health care ought to be a right, not just a privilege for the wealthy. And let's figure out the way that we could actually get this done. I think that D.C. has kind of become this place where people say, wasn't that a great speech? Didn't I make a difference? But that's not what impacts people's lives.
Why do people support Donald Trump? Who do?
I think that 2016, I said like about a quarter of my voters also voted for Donald Trump. If you go back to 2016, when 60% of Americans haven't had a pay increase in real terms in 40 years, or 2/3 of the counties in this country lost businesses over the last decade, when the economy's not working for people, and then they look at the political system, and it is captured by outside money, and it's captured by the lobbyists, and this guy said, Trump said, I will fight for you and I'll drain the swamp. Now, he hasn't been fighting for those folks. Don't kid yourself. And it's swampier today than ever before. So I think it was the frustration that, I'm not getting ahead. It's
but how about now? So if you're a strong Trumper, there's no wall and Mexico didn't pay for whatever fencing repair there has been. The middle class was going to get a huge tax break. It didn't get a huge tax break, even though the economy is doing relatively well. The sort of populist, Marjorie Egan, my regular co-host, and I were in New Hampshire for the primary, and we would ask any uncommitted voter who were they deciding between. The vast majority of people in 2016 with whom we spoke said it was incredibly enough between Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, seeing both as kind of populist.
Yeah.
So I understand that. In 2019, when he has not honored most of his pledges, he's disappointed those who had faith that he would lead a sort of billionaires populist revolt. Why are people still with him in the numbers that they still are, Governor Bullock?
Well, and I'm not an expert on Trumpology, but I
But
think
you
that,
want to be an expert on the American public.
Yeah,
I mean, why are they there?
But that's one of those things. Like, look, I think 30% of this country, no matter what, will be with him. No matter what, they'll be with them. But it's that other about 21% that many of them voted for Trump last time that we have to turn around and say we connect with their everyday lives and can offer something better. We can't just be, it can't be all about Donald Trump. But yeah, there's a good chunk of people that like the way he talks or like the way he acts and aren't going to change. But let's focus on those folks that, you know, you could go to, you said you were in New Hampshire, a third of their counties, same in Iowa. Third of their counties voted Obama, Trump. And those are the folks that we've got to get back if we're going to win this election.
Why aren't you gaining greater traction with those people? And across, I mean, when you entered this race, while the conventional wisdom, I think at the time, was a little late in the game, it's Montana, wherever Montana is. Obviously, he knows. Jared knows.
You know, bigger
Montana's,
population than Vermont or Delaware.
But
I'm just saying.
But on the other hand, I mean, a centrist. Can I call you a centrist? Do you call yourself a centrist?
You know, I call myself as kind of in that lane. Look, if the core of the word is progressive, is making progress in people's lives, I would take my record on healthcare, on education, on campaign finance against anybody in this field.
So why aren't you doing better based on that self-description?
Yeah, but I would consider myself as somebody that actually has to get stuff done, which is a little bit different than a lot of this field. I think, you know, you say, yeah, I only got in mid-May, and I had a job to do. My legislature ended on Monday. I went in on a Tuesday. I think part of the challenges has been, and I think they were well-intentioned, but the DNC debate rules, this thought that what we're going to do is get all these individual $1 donors. Well, what that allowed is these senators to transfer millions of dollars over from their Senate campaign, put it all on Facebook and Google, get those individual donors along the way. I think we've nationalized it a little bit, but I take heart in, well, one of Massachusetts' own, 45 days out from Iowa, he was at 4 points. Al Sharpton was beating him.
I remember it well.
He won Iowa. That changed it all. Our Barack Obama was 22 points behind Hillary Clinton. So I think for all of the, you know, in some ways we're already exhausted from this campaign, but it really is just starting because it's always been the early states take a big field, narrow it down.
How do you interpret the news that we were just talking about when you walked into the studio here, that you have Michael Bloomberg getting into the race, you have Deval Patrick considering getting into the race as people who could come in as the more moderate centrist voice? Do you see a need for that right now as well?
I think the diagnosis is correct. The diagnosis being that, look, if I'm the nominee, I'm going to win Massachusetts. Any Democrat with a pulse will, right? But if we can't win Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, we're not going to win this election. So the diagnosis is we got to make sure that we have somebody that can do that. Now, the treatment, their prognosis is, well, then you need another person from Massachusetts or another billionaire jumping in this race, you know, more folks from the coasts. I think that sort of their solution is misplaced. Why don't we find somebody that could actually win it?
But you don't see Elizabeth Warren being able to do it, Bernie Sanders being able to do it, despite the fact that they're at the top of the polls now.
As far as winning those places, I mean, New York Times did a big article it was last week that actually said, for all of this, let's look at those states. And no, I don't think that, look, I had to pay off $175,000 in today's terms of student debt. We have to make sure that college is affordable and accessible. But I don't think like saying, okay, free everything is the way that we win. Because most folks I talk to, they don't want everything for free, right? They just want a fair shot at a better life.
So how do you deal? You've talked about a lot about your, through this campaign, about your working relationship with, let's say, saner Republicans. How do you, assuming that the Republicans maintain a majority of the Senate, how does a Democratic president, even if he or she is perfect for this country, deal with the Mitch McConnells of the world, who are just all about, we've all read a million times about, on the night of the inauguration of Barack Obama, he met in a bar with fellow Republicans and said, we're going to stop every single thing this guy does. I assume he'd have the same conversation over the same drink if a Democrat wins in 2020.
Now, you work with some of those more thoughtful business-based Republicans along the way, but literally the next president should spend probably as much time in Kentucky as she or he does in Washington, D.C. Because once you get folks in those communities saying, wait a minute, I expected more. when I send you to Washington, D.C., I expect you to be concerned about my needs, not playing these partisan games. Because I think generally, too, folks, and that's on both sides of the aisle, they're tired of the straight partisanship, right? They want to believe government can function.
Yeah, and well, we're talking to Steve Bullock, governor of Montana, candidate for the Democratic nomination for president.
Governor, to ask you a little bit about your issue on your stance on climate change, you contend with wildfires as well in a major way. I know it's impacted your budget significantly in Montana. I've been there when I've seen the smoke come through. But at the same time, just recently you spoke about possibly approving of the Keystone Pipeline if done right. Your words, quote unquote, if done right. How could you reconcile supporting the Keystone Pipeline and face some of the issues that you've seen in Montana?
Yeah, and exactly what I said, and I actually wrote to the White House, the Council on Environmental Quality, and said, I have some real concerns about this. Look, I'm the only candidate in this whole field that would actually have the Keystone going through it. And my concerns were addressing what is the climate impacts, what is the safety, and is there meaningful consultation with tribal nations? I mean, I don't think from a general perspective, look, yeah, fire seasons, as you know, 78 days longer in the West. I had to close down the Yellowstone River right before my reelection because of fish kills. We have to take immediate and durable action. And there are steps that we can take along the way. Scientists say, right, we got to be carbon neutral by 2050. I think the U.S. could do it by 2040 or even earlier. But you said you had Jane Meyer in here not long ago.
A couple of months
I mean,
ago.
remember, George H.W. Bush even said, we'll address the greenhouse effect with the White House effect, meaning Republicans leading from the top. Newt Gingrich, when he was Speaker, said we have to address climate change. The Republican Party is now the only significant political party in the world that does acknowledge climate change is real. So we have that obstacle. We also have the obstacle that if you can't imagine how you make it to the end of the month, it's hard to care about the end of the world. So we've got to make this climate crisis into a climate opportunity to create jobs. And it's not what we're taking away, it's what we're adding that can get there.
So is that where you see jobs tied to the pipeline?
My last conversation with the White House is you have not fulfilled what I believe as the executive to have this pipeline go through. And I think that until you can turn around and say, what are the overall impacts on climate? What is the impact? I've dealt with 2 pipeline breaches in the Yellowstone River, the longest free-flowing river in the country, until you can give me that security along the way. And until there's meaningful consultation, which there hasn't been with our tribal nations, that it can't go forward, cannot go forward.
You done any work with our Governor Baker?
I have done work with
What do you think of him?
you know, I get along well with Governor Baker. He and I, well, and think about even, this was 2 years ago, we were teamed up and we testified together in Washington, D.C. as they were trying to get rid of cost-sharing reductions. I mean, meaning that this administration's been essentially trying to completely destabilize healthcare and make it that much more expensive for people along the way. So the times that I've worked with Charlie, I've appreciated him, I enjoy him, and he's somebody that, to me, seems like it's more important to get things done than it is just to play these political games.
Someone at dinner said to me last night that he is the Governor Bullock of Massachusetts. You would probably say he would say the Bullock of this, and you're the Baker of Montana. Is that way off base?
Well, I've probably been called worse than that.
Okay. So, have you ever voted for a Republican, by the way?
You know, I voted for a Republican early on, a state legislative race. Yeah, not for a president, though.
We're talking to Steve Bullock, again, governor of Montana. Before you got in the race, Governor Bullock, who were you leaning towards supporting and why?
Which of the 37 candidates?
You can pick any of the 37.
No, look, I wouldn't have gotten in the race if I didn't think that I had something unique to offer this that could win and bridge divides and get it done. So I hadn't firmly committed to anyone along the way.
How'd you feel about Hillary Clinton as a candidate in 2016?
You know, I think it's interesting. This is a longer story than you want. I was in law school when Bill Clinton was running. And my professor, he had retired from Yale, gone down to Columbia. He goes, I had both Bill and Hillary in class. I can't say much for him. She was one of the smartest people I'd ever met. Then, you know, she got dragged through 25 years of it. So I think that she certainly would have been well equipped for a lot of the things that we needed, everything from foreign policy to domestic policy. But I also think that there was a disconnect in many ways. It's easy to Monday morning quarterback. Yeah, let's not even talk about all these emails. Let's talk about but she wasn't showing up in the places that we need to. Like, if Democrats think the path to victory is just through our urban areas and our coasts, we're sorely missing what it's going to take not only to win, but also to govern.
In the category of wanting to see things done right, the border wall. What's your stance on that?
I think that, look, Democrats believe in, or at least I believe in border security. I don't think a 18th century solution of a wall is the answer by any means. And we ought to recognize the biggest problem. We have both bureaucratic issues with our overall immigration system, 450 judges for a caseload of 900,000. But the biggest problem right now we have with immigration is Donald Trump, because he's using it to literally not just rip families apart, but also rip this country apart. We need to get to the point, and we were almost at that point a few years ago, where we looked at an immigration reform program. But no, I don't think that the wall is the answer by any means.
Can we stay on judges just for a second, Governor?
Sure,
Bullock?
why not?
I am of the belief that other than deciding to declare war, the power to make lifetime appointments to the federal judiciary, including Supreme Court, is the most important one a president has. We learned, well, you probably knew this before, I learned last week the president has had more nominees confirmed, including ones rated unqualified by the American Bar Association, than either W. Bush or Obama or Clinton at this stage. The two oldest justices on the Supreme Court are two of the most liberal justices, one from across the river, Steve Breyer, obviously RBG, as we like to call her. So it's not inconceivable that even a one-term or clearly a two-term Donald Trump would have a very solid, very right-wing conservative majority in the Supreme Court. How do you deal with either of those things when he appoints 38-year-olds, 42-year-olds to lifetime appointments?
Yeah, and has already had a significant impact on this overall court system for sure. And
So what do you do?
So, and I'm not a fan of generally of the filibuster, but I think for judges it was good. Look, I've argued for the U.S. Supreme Court. I'd love to think it's non-political. Mitch McConnell showed that otherwise with Merrick Garland. So I think that we should talk about expanding the Supreme Court from 11 to 9. And
9 to 11.
Yeah, 9 to 11.
Yeah.
And I also think that we should start having a discussion overall. Like, go talk to any of your federal district court judges right now. Their caseloads are significant. There's the possibility of expanding the overall judiciary.
Would you term limit federal judges?
I would not.
Why not?
I would not. I'd rather add to them than term limit, because I think at times sort of that the wisdom on the court, the time there, and the institutional opportunities, sort of the institutional memory, it's significant. I'd rather expand it than put term limits.
Okay, so since the first time we met you, we hope to meet you many more. Tell us one thing we haven't learned about you in the last 20 minutes that you think is important for people listening in New Hampshire, for example, to know about Steve Bullock.
One thing, in Massachusetts, I've run Boston a few times.
You have?
Yeah,
You
I have.
have?
I don't look like
you actually,
it,
no,
but
you actually
I
do
don't.
look,
Yeah, you know.
You do look. Did you run it in cowboy boots or did you not?
No, I actually wore
You did.
Asics.
You
Yeah.
did. Okay.
Yeah.
That's what I run into, yeah.
Is that right?
Yep.
Jill Kayanos?
The gel cumulus.
Okay. Yeah.
Yep.
No, I think, look, anybody that looks at both what I've done and what I'm talking about is that this is a tough time in this 243-year experiment called representative democracy. Even after Democrats, hopefully we win, we've got to recognize the deep divides that are going to exist in this country. And we got to find somebody that can actually bridge some of those divides.
Steve Bullock, it's a pleasure to meet you, Governor. Thank you so much for your time.
The pleasure is mine. Thanks for having me on.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Governor. Steve Bullock is the governor of Montana and a 2020 candidate. To learn more about his campaign, go to stevebullock.com. Again, Governor, great to have you here. Well, coming up, we're going to continue the conversation we were having about Governor Deval Patrick, who's seriously considering getting into the presidential race, and asking you if this is good news for the Democrats or not. That conversation
And we should
continues.
ask what people think of Governor Bullock's candidacy at the same time.
We'll take your calls on that, too. You might want to stick around, Governor, see how they feel. All right, that's all coming up at 89.7 WGBH.